The tension in the Senate committee room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, her burgundy blazer sharp against the mahogany backdrop, while Senator Lindsey Graham loomed over the proceedings from his elevated chair. What started as a routine hearing on judicial nominations was about to become the political showdown of the decade. Graham had spent the morning grandstanding, his southern drawl echoing through the chamber as he launched attack after attack on Democratic policies. The 67-year-old veteran senator was in his element, commanding the room with the confidence of someone who'd been playing this game for over 2 decades. But he was about to discover that the 34-year-old congresswoman from Texas had brought ammunition he never saw coming. The moment that would break the internet was just seconds away. Graham, leaning into his microphone with that familiar smirk, was about to deliver what he thought would be the killing blow to Crockett's testimony. Instead, he was walking straight into a trap that would leave him speechless and trending on social media within the hour. Before we dive into exactly what happened, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. You won't want to miss a single moment of this political earthquake that's about to unfold before your eyes. The cameras captured everything with crystal clarity. Graham's confident posture as he shuffled through his prepared materials. Crockett's steady gaze as she quietly organized her own documents. The packed gallery holding its collective breath, sensing that something unprecedented was about to happen. Nobody in that room knew they were about to witness a masterclass in political warfare that would reshape both careers forever and send shockwaves through the entire Washington establishment. The stage was perfectly set for what would become one of the most watched political confrontations in recent memory. Graham, the master of committee theatrics, had chosen his target carefully, or so he thought. What he didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett had been preparing for this exact moment for weeks, studying his tactics, researching his vulnerabilities, and crafting a response that would turn his own weapons against him with devastating precision. The atmosphere in the chamber was electric with anticipation. Political insiders and veteran journalists who had covered Washington for decades could sense something unusual brewing. The usual pre-hearing chatter had died down to an unusual silence, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that suggested this wouldn't be just another routine committee proceeding. Graham's staff had briefed him extensively on what they perceived as Crockett's weaknesses. They'd compiled opposition research folders filled with her progressive voting record, her statements supporting criminal justice reform, and what they saw as her inexperience with high-stakes political combat. They'd prepared talking points about her youth, her activism background, and what they characterized as her radical positions on law enforcement issues. What Graham's team had failed to adequately research, however, was Crockett's actual courtroom, experience and her track record of going up against seasoned opponents who underestimated her capabilities. They'd focused so intently on her progressive politics that they'd overlooked her fundamental skills as a litigator and her ability to think strategically under pressure. Crockett's preparation had been far more thorough and sophisticated. She'd assembled a team of researchers who had spent weeks diving deep into Graham's complete voting history, not just on judicial nominees, but on issues of civil rights, criminal justice reform, and constitutional interpretation. They'd identified patterns of inconsistency that spanned his entire career, moments where his positions had shifted dramatically based on political expediency rather than principle. More importantly, Crockett had studied video footage of Graham's previous committee performances, analyzing his body language, his preferred attack patterns, and the specific ways he tried to intimidate witnesses. She'd practiced her responses with mock interrogations, preparing for every possible line of attack he might deploy against her. For over 20 years, Lindsey Graham had been a fixture in Washington's power circles, building his reputation as a fierce defender of conservative values and a master of committee theatrics. His sharp tongue and quick wit had dismantled countless witnesses before Crockett ever set foot in the chamber. Graham's strategy was always the same: intimidate, dominate, and leave his opponents scrambling for coherent responses while he scored points with voters back home. The South Carolina senator had perfected the art of the political ambush, using his seniority and institutional knowledge like finely honed weapons. He knew exactly how to rattle witnesses, how to make them defensive, how to create viral moments that would play well on cable news shows and social media platforms. Today's hearing on federal judicial appointments was supposed to be another routine victory lap, another chance to demonstrate his political dominance to a national audience. Graham's rise to political prominence had been built on moments exactly like this one. He'd made his reputation during previous high-profile hearings, using his prosecutorial background and theatrical instincts to create memorable television moments that energized conservative voters and intimidated Democratic opponents. His questioning style was legendary among Washington insiders, combining legal precision with political showmanship in ways that few senators could match. The veteran senator had spent decades cultivating relationships with conservative media outlets, legal organizations, and political donors who appreciated his willingness to take on liberal politicians and progressive activists in public forums. His committee performances weren't just about policy, they were carefully choreographed political theater designed to advance his broader career ambitions and maintain his status as a conservative champion. Graham had done his homework on Crockett, or so he thought. His staff had prepared extensive briefing materials covering her background as a criminal defense attorney, her progressive voting record during her brief time in Congress, and what they characterized as her radical positions on criminal justice reform. Young Congresswoman, first term, vocal progressive, who'd made waves with her committee assignments and her willingness to challenge Republican talking points. In Graham's experienced mind, informed by decades of similar confrontations, she represented a familiar type. The rookie politician, who needed to be publicly humiliated before she gained too much confidence or media attention. He'd handled dozens of similar witnesses before, bright and ambitious newcomers who ultimately proved to be outmatched by his superior experience, political savvy, and institutional advantages. Graham's confidence was rooted in a long history of successful political combat. He'd been part of major confirmation battles, had questioned cabinet nominees, had participated in investigations that dominated national headlines. His ability to create viral moments and generate favorable media coverage had made him one of the most sought-after political figures for television appearances and conservative events. What Graham didn't fully appreciate was how dramatically the political landscape had shifted during his decades in Washington. The old rules of engagement that had served him so well were becoming less effective against a new generation of politicians who approached these confrontations with different strategies, better preparation, and a complete lack of intimidation by traditional power structures. But Graham had made a critical error in judgment, one that would cost him dearly in the coming confrontation. He had seriously underestimated his opponent, viewing her through the lens of traditional Washington politics, rather than recognizing the new breed of politician she represented. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just any first-term representative riding a wave of progressive enthusiasm into office. The Texas Democrat had spent years as a civil rights attorney, going toe-to-toe with seasoned prosecutors and hostile judges in courtrooms across the state. She'd built her entire legal career on being underestimated, on letting opponents think they had the upper hand before she revealed her true strength and turned their assumptions against them. Her background wasn't just in politics. It was in the art of intellectual combat, where preparation and precision mattered more than seniority or institutional position. Crockett's legal experience had taught her lessons that most politicians never learned. She understood how to research opponents thoroughly, how to identify inconsistencies in their arguments, how to remain calm under pressure, and how to deliver devastating responses with surgical precision. Her courtroom experience had prepared her for exactly this type of high-stakes confrontation. Her path to Congress had been unconventional compared to many of her colleagues. While other politicians had climbed traditional ladders through local offices and party organizations, Crockett had built her reputation in courtrooms, defending clients against a justice system that was often stacked against them. She'd learned to fight for underdogs, to challenge authority when it was wrong, and to never back down from powerful opponents who tried to intimidate her. At 34, Crockett represented something that terrified establishment politicians on both sides of the aisle. A new generation of Democratic leadership that was young, diverse, fearless, and completely unimpressed by Washington's traditional power structures. She'd already made waves in her short time in Congress, with her sharp questioning during committee hearings and her ability to cut through political doublespeak with laser-like precision. Her committee assignments had been strategic choices designed to maximize her ability to challenge Republican narratives and expose conservative hypocrisy on issues she cared deeply about. She'd used every opportunity to demonstrate that the new generation of Democratic leaders was intellectually equipped to match or exceed the policy expertise of their more experienced Republican counterparts. Crockett's media appearances during her first term had showcased a politician who was comfortable with confrontation, articulate under pressure, and capable of delivering memorable sound bites that energized progressive voters while making compelling arguments to moderate audiences. She'd proven herself adept at the modern political skill of creating viral moments that advanced policy arguments rather than just personal brand building. But today's judicial nomination hearing would be her true coming-out party on the national political stage. Her moment to prove that the new generation of Democratic leaders could not only survive Washington's brutal political combat, but could dominate it when properly prepared and strategically focused. Crockett had spent weeks preparing for this specific moment, knowing that Graham would likely target her during the proceedings. She'd studied his questioning patterns, his favorite lines of attack, his go-to strategies for rattling witnesses and making them appear unprepared or incompetent. More importantly, she'd done extensive research on Graham himself, diving deep into his voting record, his past statements, his moments of obvious hypocrisy that she could weaponize if the situation called for it. This wasn't just about judicial nominations anymore, though the underlying policy questions remained critically important. With midterm elections approaching and both parties looking for moments that could energize their respective bases and shift the national political conversation, the stakes had grown far beyond the specific nominees being discussed. Graham needed to show Republican voters that he was still the conservative warrior they'd sent to Washington decades ago, still capable of taking on the liberal elite and emerging victorious. Crockett, meanwhile, needed to prove that the new generation of Democrats could go blow for blow with the Republican Party's most seasoned political fighters, and not just survive, but dominate the encounter. The progressive base was watching closely, looking for signs that their young champions could stand up to the bullying tactics that had intimidated Democratic politicians for years. The hearing room was packed beyond capacity with congressional staffers, political journalists, legal observers, and activist groups from across the political spectrum who all sensed that something significant was about to happen. Social media was already buzzing with anticipation as clips from the morning session circulated online, building momentum toward what everyone expected would be a major confrontation between the old guard and the new generation. The fireworks began when Graham seized control of his allotted questioning time with the theatrical flair that had made him famous throughout his Senate career. Leaning back in his chair with practiced confidence, he fixed Crockett with the condescending stare that had intimidated countless witnesses before her, his eyes carrying that familiar mixture of amusement and barely concealed contempt that suggested he was about to enjoy what came next. "Representative Crockett," Graham began, his voice carrying that distinctive blend of Southern charm and political aggression that had become his trademark over decades of committee hearings. "I've been looking at your record quite carefully, and I have to say, I'm deeply concerned about your understanding of basic constitutional principles and your fitness to question judicial nominees." The gallery stirred with anticipation as Graham pulled out a thick folder of prepared materials, documents, and quotes that his staff had carefully selected to support his planned line of attack. This was his signature move, the document dump designed to overwhelm opponents and make them appear unprepared, a tactic he'd used to devastating effect against previous witnesses who had made the mistake of underestimating his preparation and political cunning. "In your time as a defense attorney," Graham continued, his voice rising with theatrical indignation as he flipped through his prepared materials, "you represented clients who were accused of serious crimes against innocent victims. You've consistently criticized our dedicated law enforcement officers, questioned the integrity of our hard-working prosecutors, undermined confidence in our justice system, and now you want to lecture this committee about judicial qualifications and constitutional interpretation? Crockett remained perfectly still throughout Graham's opening salvo, her hands folded calmly on the table before her, her expression betraying nothing of her internal thoughts or emotional state. She'd expected exactly this line of attack and had prepared her responses accordingly, but she also knew that reacting defensively would play directly into Graham's strategic plan. The veteran senator was just getting started with his performance. You know what I find particularly troubling about your record, Representative? Graham's voice took on a more aggressive edge as he warmed to his theme, clearly enjoying what he believed was his dominant position in the exchange. Your constant reliance on identity politics and victimhood narratives. Everything with your political movement is about race, about gender, about grievance and victim status rather than merit and qualifications. You can't have a serious conversation about judicial fitness because you're too busy checking demographic boxes and pandering to special interest groups. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Graham ventured into dangerous territory that had gotten other politicians in trouble before. Several Democratic senators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing the inflammatory nature of Graham's comments and the potential for this exchange to spiral into something much more serious than a routine policy disagreement. But the South Carolina senator was fully committed to his attack strategy now, convinced that he could provoke an emotional response from Crockett that would undermine her credibility and make her appear unstable or unqualified to participate in serious policy discussions. He'd used similar tactics against other young Democratic politicians with great success, watching them lose their composure and damage their own reputations. I've been in this business for a very long time, Graham continued, his condescension now fully on display as he leaned forward in his chair. And I've seen a lot of people come through these halls, thinking they know better than those of us, who've been here fighting the good fight for decades, defending constitutional principles and conservative values against liberal attacks on our institutions. Graham paused for dramatic effect, clearly savoring what he believed was his moment of triumph, before delivering what he thought would be his knockout punch. But experience matters in this business, Representative Crockett. Wisdom comes with age and seasoning. Years of service and proven results matter more than flashy rhetoric and progressive talking points. And frankly, based on what I've seen from your record and your public statements, I'm not convinced you've demonstrated either the experience or the wisdom necessary for this serious responsibility. What Graham didn't realize was that he was actually walking deeper into a carefully laid trap that Crockett had spent weeks preparing. The Congresswoman had studied his entire playbook extensively and knew exactly where his line of questioning was heading. More importantly, she'd come prepared with ammunition that would turn his own words and voting record against him in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate. Graham's attack strategy followed a predictable pattern that Crockett had observed in dozens of his previous committee performances. He would start with broad accusations designed to put his target on the defensive, then narrow his focus to specific criticisms that were difficult to address comprehensively in a short response time, and finally deliver what he believed would be a knockout punch that would leave his opponent looking unprepared and unqualified. The problem with Graham's approach was that it relied heavily on his opponents being unprepared for his tactics or intimidated by his senatorial authority. Most witnesses who appeared before congressional committees were policy experts or government officials who weren't accustomed to this level of political combat. They typically tried to answer his questions directly and substantively, which played right into his strategy of creating sound bites that made them look defensive or evasive. Crockett, however, had spent her legal career dealing with prosecutors who used similar intimidation tactics, and she'd developed counter-strategies that turned those approaches against the attackers themselves. She understood that Graham's questions weren't really seeking information. They were designed to create political theater, which meant she could respond with her own form of political theater that would be far more effective. Her research team had identified several key vulnerabilities in Graham's political record that she could exploit if he chose to make the hearing personal rather than substantive. They'd found instances where his positions had evolved dramatically, based on political convenience, statements he'd made that directly contradicted his current positions, and voting patterns that revealed significant inconsistencies in his supposed principles. Most importantly, Crockett had studied the psychology of Graham's committee performances and understood that his confidence was built on a foundation of assumption that his opponents would play by traditional rules of political engagement. If she could disrupt those expectations and force him to respond to unexpected challenges, she could potentially turn his own tactics against him in ways that would be far more devastating than anything he could do to her. "Let me ask you directly." "Representative," Graham said, leaning forward with the supreme confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards in this political poker game, his voice carrying the full weight of his senatorial authority and decades of experience in similar confrontations. "Do you honestly believe that your extremely limited experience in government and your obvious political bias make you qualified to question the credentials of judicial nominees who have spent decades serving their communities with distinction and honor?" The room fell into complete silence as Graham finished his question, the kind of pregnant pause that suggested everyone present understood they were witnessing a pivotal moment in what had started as a routine hearing, but was now clearly becoming something much more significant. This was exactly the moment Graham expected Crockett to stumble, to get defensive, to prove his point about her unsuitability for the serious business of governance and judicial oversight. Graham's question had been carefully crafted to create multiple layers of difficulty for any response Crockett might offer. If she defended her qualifications, she would appear defensive and self-serving. If she acknowledged her limited experience, she would validate his criticism. If she attacked his premises, she would appear to be dodging the question. It was the kind of political trap that had worked effectively against dozens of previous targets. The gallery held its breath as political observers, journalists, and congressional staffers waited to see how the young congresswoman would handle what appeared to be an impossible question designed to end her credibility in this forum. Many expected her to either get flustered or launch into a defensive explanation that would play directly into Graham's narrative about her inexperience and unfitness for this responsibility. Instead of showing any signs of intimidation or defensiveness, Crockett slowly and deliberately reached for her own folder of documents, her movements calm and controlled, her expression giving away nothing of her internal preparation for what was about to become a political masterclass in preparation meeting. Opportunity. The confidence in her body language suggested she had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Senator Graham," Crockett began, her voice steady and clear as she opened her prepared materials, "I genuinely appreciate your question about experience and qualifications because it gives me an opportunity to address something that I think the American people deserve to understand better about how this process really works." Graham's confident smile began to falter slightly, as something in Crockett's tone and demeanor suggested she wasn't about to play the defensive role he had scripted for her in this political theater. Graham made one final, desperate attempt to regain control of the hearing as he realized that his carefully planned attack wasn't proceeding according to his expectations. His face flushed red with a dangerous mixture of anger, embarrassment, and growing panic as he recognized that he was losing control of the narrative he had worked so hard to establish. "Now hold on just a minute, Representative," Graham barked, his southern drawl becoming more pronounced as his composure began to slip away. "I've been faithfully serving the people of South Carolina and defending conservative principles in this chamber longer than you've been practicing law or involved in politics at any level." The veteran senator slammed his gavel on the desk with unnecessary force, the sharp sound echoing through the suddenly tense chamber as he raised his voice to command attention and reassert his traditional authority. "I don't need lectures about consistency or constitutional interpretation from someone who's been in Congress for all of 5 minutes and whose entire political career is based on progressive activism rather than serious governance." Graham thought this display of senatorial authority would be his moment to definitively reassert dominance over the proceedings, to remind everyone in the room of the established hierarchy and his unquestioned place at the top of it. His decades, of experience had taught him that younger politicians would typically back down when confronted with this kind of institutional pressure and public intimidation. Instead, he had just handed Jasmine Crockett the perfect setup for what would become the most devastating political takedown of the year, a moment that would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform and analyzed by political commentators for months to come. Crockett didn't raise her voice or show any signs of being intimidated by Graham's theatrical display of anger. She didn't need to resort to volume or dramatic gestures. Her response was delivered with the cold precision of a surgeon making a critical incision, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact and devastating effectiveness. "Senator Graham," Crockett said, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade, calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "I understand that you've been here a long time, and I respect the office you hold and the constituents you represent. But longevity in politics isn't the same as effectiveness in governance, and seniority in this institution isn't automatically equivalent to wisdom or integrity." The room went completely silent as Crockett paused, allowing her words to sink in, before continuing with surgical precision. Graham's mouth opened slightly in preparation for a response, but no words came out as he processed what was happening to his carefully constructed political persona. "And frankly, Senator, after watching your performance here today and reviewing your voting record over the past several years, I'm starting to think the only thing you've truly mastered during your decades of service is the art of political hypocrisy and partisan double standards." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the barely audible sound of cameras clicking and the quiet rustle of papers as journalists frantically took notes. But Crockett wasn't finished delivering her knockout combination of political punches. "You want to talk about my 5 minutes in Congress versus your decades of service? Fine, let's have that conversation," Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength and confidence with each carefully crafted sentence. "In my 5 minutes here, I've actually taken the time to read the Constitution you claim to defend so passionately. I've studied the judicial philosophy and legal precedents you pretend to understand when it serves your political purposes." She paused again, letting the impact of her words register throughout the chamber before delivering the most devastating part of her response. "Most importantly, I've maintained consistent principles and voting patterns that don't magically change based on which political party happens to control the White House or what's politically convenient for my re-election campaigns. So yes, Senator, I may be new to this institution, but at least I know what I stand for, and I have the courage to stick to those principles even when it's difficult. Can you honestly say the same?" The moment of absolute silence that followed was unlike anything anyone in the chamber had ever experienced. For perhaps the first time in his lengthy and distinguished Senate career, Lindsey Graham was completely and utterly speechless, his decades of political experience and rhetorical skill rendered useless against Crockett's precisely targeted attack. Cameras captured every second of his stunned reaction in excruciating detail. His hands visibly trembled as he reached for his water glass, his movements unsteady and uncertain. His trademark confident smirk had been completely replaced by the unmistakable look of someone who had just been intellectually demolished on national television in front of millions of viewers. The gallery, which had been holding its collective breath throughout the exchange, began to buzz with barely contained excitement and whispered conversations. Democratic staffers in the room struggled to contain their obvious delight, while Republican aides looked on in absolute horror at their champion's very public humiliation at the hands of a first-term representative. Graham finally started to speak, then stopped abruptly as his voice caught in his throat. He tried again with visible effort. That's completely... But the words simply wouldn't come, his usual eloquence and political skill abandoning him at the moment he needed them most. The master of political theater, the man who had built his entire career on quick comebacks and devastating retorts, had been reduced to stammering sentence fragments on live television, his reputation crumbling in real time as millions of Americans watched his complete political collapse. Sensing Graham's complete disorientation and recognizing the perfect moment to deliver her final devastating blow. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her voice remaining calm and controlled, even as she prepared to end his political credibility once and for all. "Senator, I came here today prepared to have a serious discussion about judicial qualifications and constitutional interpretation, not to embarrass a colleague or score political points," Crockett continued, her tone suggesting disappointment rather than triumph. "But since you chose to make this exchange personal rather than substantive, since you decided to question my character rather than engage with my arguments, let me be completely clear about what I've observed here today." The chamber remained absolutely silent as Crockett paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room before she continued with surgical precision. "Experience without integrity is just practiced corruption. Seniority without substance is just organized incompetence. And frankly, Senator Graham, your performance today has been a masterclass in both of those failures. You've demonstrated exactly why the American people are losing faith in this institution and in politicians who think their longevity in office somehow exempts them from basic standards of honesty and consistency." She paused again, her eyes never leaving Graham's increasingly pale face as she prepared to deliver the line that would be replayed millions of times across every social media platform and news outlet in the country. "I may be young, Senator, but I'm not naive. I can see right through your political theater and your manufactured outrage. And based on your reaction right now, I think everyone else in this room can too. The question Americans should be asking isn't whether I'm qualified to question judicial nominees. The question they should be asking is whether you're still qualified to evaluate them." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sounds audible in the chamber were the quiet clicks of camera shutters and the barely perceptible hum of the air conditioning system. Graham sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through various shades of red and white as he processed the complete destruction of his carefully cultivated political persona. His hands continued to tremble as he made several false starts at "I," responding, his mouth opening and closing without producing any coherent words. The man who had made a decades-long career out of creating memorable sound bites and dominating political conversations had been rendered completely speechless by a first-term representative who had turned his own tactics against him with devastating effectiveness. The committee chair, recognizing that Graham was in no condition to continue and that the hearing had devolved far beyond its original purpose, quickly called for a recess to allow both sides to regroup. But the damage had been done, and everyone in the room understood that they had just witnessed a fundamental shift in the political dynamic between these two figures. As the room erupted in controlled chaos, with journalists rushing to file their stories and staffers hurrying to brief their respective bosses on what had just transpired, Crockett calmly gathered her materials with the same composed professionalism she had displayed throughout the entire confrontation. She had just delivered one of the most devastating political takedowns in recent memory, and she made it look completely effortless. Graham remained seated for several long moments after the recess was called, staring blankly ahead with the expression of someone who had just watched their entire worldview collapse in real time. His staff eventually surrounded him, trying to shield their boss from the cameras that continued to capture his stunned reaction and obvious disorientation. The contrast between the two figures couldn't have been more stark. Crockett, the supposed political novice, walked confidently from the witness table, shaking hands with supporters and maintaining the same calm demeanor she had displayed throughout the hearing. Graham, the veteran senator and supposed master of political combat, had to be practically guided from the chamber by his staff, still visibly shaken by what had just occurred. As news of the confrontation began to spread beyond the committee room, it became clear that this wasn't just another routine political skirmish, but a moment that would have lasting implications for both participants and for the broader political landscape. Crockett had announced herself as a force to be reckoned with, while Graham's reputation as an intimidating political operator had been permanently damaged. Within minutes of the hearing's dramatic conclusion, social media platforms across the Internet erupted with clips, commentary, and analysis of Crockett's devastating political takedown. The hashtag #CrockettDestroysGraham began trending nationally before the senators had even finished packing up their materials and left the chamber, with thousands of users sharing the most impactful moments from the confrontation, the most widely shared clip showed the exact moment when Graham realized he was completely outmatched, his confident smirk disappearing in real time as Crockett methodically dismantled his arguments and exposed his hypocritical voting record. Another viral video captured his visible trembling as he reached for his water glass, unable to formulate a coherent response to her surgical precision. Social media users immediately began creating an endless stream of memes and commentary. One particularly popular image showed Graham's stunned facial expression, with the caption, "When you pick a fight with someone who actually did their homework and came prepared." Another featured Crockett's calm, composed expression, with the text, "This is what real preparation and intellectual courage look like in politics." The hashtag The Crockett Masterclass started trending alongside the original, as political observers, constitutional law experts, and legal scholars began analyzing the tactical brilliance of her performance and breaking down how she had systematically used Graham's own words and inconsistent voting record to expose his partisan motivations and intellectual dishonesty. Democratic leadership across the country was extraordinarily quick to capitalize on the viral political moment. Within hours of the hearing's conclusion, fundraising emails featuring clips of Crockett's performance were hitting inboxes nationwide. "This is what the new generation of Democratic leadership looks like," declared one particularly effective email, featuring a prominent link encouraging donations to support Crockett's re-election campaign and other rising progressive candidates. Progressive organizations and advocacy groups that had never heard of Jasmine Crockett before the hearing suddenly began promoting her as a rising star in the Democratic Party and a symbol of the intellectual firepower that younger politicians could bring to policy debates. Legal advocacy organizations praised her comprehensive understanding of constitutional principles and her remarkable ability to articulate complex judicial philosophy in terms that ordinary Americans could understand and appreciate. Republican reactions to the confrontation ranged from defensive deflection to obvious embarrassment about their champion's performance. Some party loyalists tried desperately to claim that Graham had been ambushed by unfair tactics, or that the hearing had been structured to disadvantage conservative participants. Others quietly acknowledged among themselves that their longtime standard-bearer had been completely outplayed and humiliated by someone they had previously dismissed as an inexperienced newcomer. Conservative media commentators struggled mightily to find effective ways to spin what was obviously a disaster for their political movement. Several GOP senators who had previously dismissed Crockett as an inexperienced progressive activist suddenly began treating her with newfound respect and caution. Word spread quickly through Republican political circles that this was definitely not someone to underestimate in future political confrontations. Every major news outlet led their coverage with detailed analysis of the political showdown. Television networks ran the most dramatic clips on continuous repeat, each broadcast generating fresh waves of social media engagement and public discussion.
Cable news programs brought in constitutional experts, political strategists, and even body language specialists to analyze Graham's physical reaction to being so thoroughly outmaneuvered. The story quickly transcended traditional political media,
appearing on entertainment programs and late-night comedy shows, where Graham's stunned expression became instant meme material, while Crockett's composed professional delivery was praised as a masterclass in effective political communication and intellectual preparation. International media outlets picked up the story as well, with foreign correspondents noting how the confrontation perfectly represented the changing face of American political leadership and the generational shifts taking place within both major political parties. The stark contrast between the old guard's reliance on bluster and intimidation versus the new generation's emphasis on substance and preparation became a talking point for political observers worldwide. For Graham personally, the hearing represented a significant and potentially permanent blow to his carefully cultivated image as a formidable political operator and conservative intellectual. His staff spent days attempting damage control, but the video evidence of his humiliation was impossible to spin or explain away convincingly. Republican donors and political supporters began privately questioning whether Graham was still the effective advocate and fundraising draw they had supported financially for decades. His upcoming re-election campaign suddenly looked potentially vulnerable, as possible challengers sensed weakness in someone who had previously seemed politically invincible and untouchable. For Crockett, the hearing served as a launching pad from relative political obscurity to national prominence virtually overnight. Speaking requests poured in from universities, legal organizations, and political groups across the country. Major political action committees that specialize in supporting rising Democratic stars began reaching out about providing campaign support and strategic resources for her future political endeavors. The confrontation ultimately became a powerful symbol of generational change in American politics, demonstrating how older politicians who had relied primarily on seniority and institutional tradition to maintain their authority suddenly found themselves facing younger colleagues who were better prepared, more articulate, and completely unintimidated by Washington's traditional power structures and intimidation tactics. Political science professors began incorporating the hearing into their curricula as a compelling case study in effective legislative strategy and political communication. Law schools added the confrontation to their courses as an outstanding example of how thorough preparation and strategic thinking could overcome significant institutional advantages and established power dynamics. Thanks for watching this incredible display of political preparation meeting opportunity in real time. If you enjoyed seeing Jasmine Crockett's masterful takedown of Lindsey Graham's bullying tactics, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss future political confrontations and analysis. Let us know in the comments which political showdown you'd like us to cover next, because there are definitely plenty more examples of younger politicians refusing to be intimidated by the Washington establishment. Until next time, remember that, in modern politics, thorough preparation and intellectual courage will always triumph over seniority and empty bluster.